I'm Jane Harmon. For 3 more days, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center. This is my last weekday in this role. I will move to President Emerita after that, so don't think I'm disappearing off the earth. But I had to impose myself at the front end of this discussion for a couple of reasons. Of course, one of them is the author, Joby Warrick, who wrote this book and his prior book at the Wilson Center. We all know that the most famous authors do that. Joby had no reputation before he showed up. Same thing goes for Tom Friedman, who wrote his book From Beirut to Jerusalem at the Wilson Center, for David Sanger, who wrote 2 books at the Wilson Center, and so on and so on. So I just had to make that point. He'll be more fully introduced, I know, by Rob Litvak in a moment. The other thing I wanted to brag about is that we have lured to the Wilson Center to chair our Middle East program, Jim Jeffrey, vaunted ambassador to many places and senior NSC and State Department person. And he's been at the Wilson Center for a few months, and it's wonderful. And Jim and Joby will be in conversation, but it means so much to me that over my tenure, only 10 years, that people of this caliber have come to the Wilson Center. And I leave with joy and tears. I really do, to think how well the place is doing. Finally, the person I'm turning this conversation over to is Rob Litvak, who has been at the Wilson Center 2 more decades than I have. Imagine that. Also has worked at the NSC, has written some of our major books on non-proliferation. But we have had a running argument, and I just have to close with this. This running argument, he knows, he's going to smile, for 10 years is this. The name of the Wilson Center, the living memorial to Woodrow Wilson, is the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Rob keeps insisting that all these people who are scholars are fellows. I don't know what a fellow is, but someday he will persuade me, or maybe not. But at this point, I just want to say what a joy it is to have presided over so many of these and been involved with them, and what a joy it is to see the center continue at this highest level. And now over to you, a Wilson Center scholar, our senior vice president, Rob Litvak, who's muted. You're muted, Rob.
The perpetual question of the Zoom era, can you hear me? Which by definition, those who cannot hear you will not reply. As Henry Kissinger once remarked, yes, Joby, please do tell all your colleagues at the Post that you are a full-fledged scholar now, okay? And let me join Jane in welcoming all of you to the virtual Wilson Center for the launch of Joby Warrick's new book, Red Line, which tells the unknown story of America's mission to stop the brutal Assad regime from using chemical weapons against its own people in Syria's horrific civil war, and keeping those weapons out of the hands of the Islamic State. Red Line is already a bestseller on Amazon, and the reviews are just coming in. Publishers Weekly calls it comprehensive and electric. Joby is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner who's on the Washington Post national staff, covering national security, the environment, the Middle East, and terrorism. His first book, The Triple Agent, recounts the 2009 suicide attack by an Al-Qaeda informant on a CIA base at Khost, Afghanistan, that killed 7 US intelligence operatives. His second book, 2015's Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS, which he worked on, as Jane noted, as a Wilson Public Policy Fellow, was awarded a 2016 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. I couldn't resist that, Jane. I'm sorry. We were delighted to have Joby back with us as a fellow during the researching and writing of his third book, Red Line. And Joby, I mean, I read a lot of nonfiction. He has a brilliant, character-driven narrative style of nonfiction. I mean, he's heading into Joseph Conrad territory or something. I mean, it's fantastic. And he tells a big story through individuals' lives. And you'll get a sense of that in his opening remarks. And Joby, as Jane mentioned, will be followed by our discussant, Ambassador James Jeffrey, who were delighted joined the Wilson Center in December 2020 as chair of the Middle East program. Ambassador Jeffrey served as the Secretary's special representative for Syria engagement and was special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS until November 8, 2020. He was a senior American diplomat with experience in political security, politics, security, and energy issues in the Middle East, including as ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. After there are remarks, we'll have a discussion period. And those of you watching may submit a question via email to mep@wilsoncenter.org. And we'll collect those questions and bring them into the conversation. So with that, Joby, welcome virtually back to the Wilson Center. I look forward to some sense of normalcy when you can come across Washington and have a tuna sandwich in our dining room again. But until then, we'll have to do it virtually. The floor is yours. And you're muted.
Okay, we're good. I think we're good. Okay, so everybody can hear me now? It's great to be back at the Wilson Center, even if it's virtual, and I'm just delighted that Jane could join us. It's a time of transition for what I know will be a very exciting new chapter for her, and I just want to take a moment to thank her personally, virtually, for her support, her encouragement, for tolerating my lounging around the cafeteria for 2 different fellowships or scholarships, excuse me, and I really enjoyed it. And the same goes for all my friends at Wilson, who I'm honored to call colleagues after my 2 fellowships there. The Wilson Center allowed me the time and freedom to do research on my last 2 books, as Jane said, and I literally could not have done it without you and with all of you. And I just miss you all, and I hope to see you again soon, including Jane in her new role. I'm honored and honestly a bit intimidated to be sharing the billing with Ambassador Jeffrey and with my good friend Rob. My book is about weapons of mass destruction and the Middle East, and I happen to have here with me on this virtual platform 2 of the country's best experts on those subjects. And I can honestly say that the 2 of them have forgotten more about these issues than I'll ever know. So for viewers, I hope that you'll take advantage of the expertise and experience that's here today to ask questions when it's time. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief and limited to really one aspect of the book that appeals to me personally, and I hope it will appeal to you as well, because it's about people, and at the bottom line in my reporting and my stories, it's the stories of people that really move us, and that's what I tried to do in Red Line. I know it's never fun to stare at a screen, so I'm going to actually put some photos up as we talk, just to give a little bit of context so you can see some faces and hear a little bit more about the people we're going to talk about today. Okay, so I think everybody in this room recognizes that the Syrian crisis was, and continues to be a policy disaster area, in addition to being a humanitarian and security catastrophe. The United States, the UN, its partners and allies in the region have all failed repeatedly. We failed to stem the bleeding, to stop the violence, to end the suffering. We failed to prevent the rise of extremism and terrorism, to seek justice for victims. It's been one of the epic failures of our time. Yet there was one issue, here we go. One issue, one crisis that briefly brought the international community together with resolve to do something about Syria. And that one issue, of course, was the use of chemical weapons. Violations of the Red Line, violations of the century-old taboo against the use of these extremely lethal poisons that kill indiscriminately and horrifically. To the people of Syria, this was just one more means of killing and destroying. And the emphasis on a single type of weapons can seem mystifying for some and infuriating. But this is the story of how the Syrian crisis evolves. And for me, the chemical weapons saga becomes a narrative thread, a way of explaining and bringing context to an extremely complicated and heartbreaking story. So in my reporting, I head out to understand the origins, how the crisis started, how the multiple responses and solutions, some successful, some not, played out. And I tell this story through experiences of individuals who were there and people whose lives were shaped by the events of 2013 and 2014. Some of the big decision makers and players you know about, the Obamas, the Putins, the Assads, but there are also other actors who face critical choices and end up playing outsized roles. There are victims and villains, spies and scientists, terrorists and diplomats, ship captains and engineers, activists and housewives and mothers. Some faces their challenges heroically, even in the face of danger and futility. And it was these stories, the stories of the more ordinary people, that drew me to writing the book. And much of the red line is about them. So let's take a few minutes to meet some of them. In the beginning, there was a laboratory, and not just any lab, a military research lab whose purpose is to create a weapon of mass destruction for Syria's dictator. In this lab, we meet a most unusual scientist, a man who was educated in the United States and fell in love with America, only to return home to become first a weapons scientist and then a top researcher in a secret program to make lethal weapons for the Syrian state. If you read the excerpt in the Washington Post, you're familiar with the story of Ayman. He's a bit quirky. He's a man who decided to marry 2 different women, and that's something you're legally allowed to do in Syria, but it's a bit unusual for a professional like himself. He talks about his odd family configuration to a visiting American in this snippet from the book. He seemed compelled to justify his living arrangements as another man might explain an extravagant impulse purchase. His first wife was an excellent cook, he said, but he decided to marry a second, considerably younger woman, his secretary, out of a purely carnal attraction. Who could have foreseen such turmoil? The 2 women squabbled constantly, except for the times when they united to direct their scorn at him. He had wanted a spicier love life, and he ended up with a case of perpetual heartburn. I don't recommend it, he said. But Ayman wore yet another hat. He was a spy for the CIA. He was recruited in the late 1980s and passed secret information to the Americans for more than a decade. And one day he decided to give a CIA handler a sample of his wares, a vial containing deadly sarin that the CIA could take home and analyze. The transfer takes place in the front seat of a car. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the scientist pulled out a small package. It's nearly Christmas. You're a Christian, the chemist said, handing over the bundle. Here's a Christmas present. A few minutes later, the American was left alone to ponder what was inside the parcel's plain wrapping. Now, Ayman was ultimately betrayed, and how and why that happened, well, I'm not going to give away the ending, but the story takes a dramatic twist in a way that seals Ayman's fate. But years later, when a brutal civil war erupts in Syria, the Americans understand very well the nature of the hidden danger that exists in Syria. The information from the spy makes clear that this conflict is going to be very different from the other uprisings that were part of Arab Spring. In underground bunkers scattered around Syria is enough sarin to fill several small swimming pools. With the country unraveling, this weapon is a grave threat for Syrians and for the entire world. Later in the book, we meet this man, an Army chemical weapons expert named Tim Blades. Tim is, to put it mildly, and I think he would agree with me on this, a colorful character. He's gruff and profane, cantankerous. He has literal physical scars from accidental exposures to chemical weapons in his youth, but he's kind of the Ray Donovan of the chemical weapons world. He and his team are the ones that can swoop in and figure out how to make bad stuff disappear. In late 2012, Pentagon officials are struggling to figure out what to do with Syria's chemical weapons, and they decide to meet with Tim. If somehow the Americans can get their hands on all these chemicals, how can they get rid of them? Tim thinks it over, says, I have an idea. He huddles with his team in Edgewood, Maryland, and in a few weeks, they have a blueprint for a prototype. It's a portable machine that can fit inside 2 tractor trailers and can be set up anywhere in the world. The machine neutralizes sarin irreversibly, and the construction costs are less than it takes to build a single Army tank. Tim builds his contraption. Some will call it the Margarita machine. It works. The Pentagon orders 7 of them, and they go into a warehouse in Maryland. No one thinks they'll ever actually be used. Tim complains about this to his wife one day. We paid a lot of money to build 7 of these things, he said, recalling his words to his wife years later. We're never going to use them. But then, bam, was I ever wrong. In the middle of 2013, there were reports coming out of Syria that the Assad government is starting to experiment with small-scale attacks using chemical weapons. Little pinpricks here and there, pushing against the red line, but also trying out a sort of a truth of theory. Can these weapons be used to break the back of the opposition, to frighten the rebels and make them run? The response to these attacks is outrage around the world and a demand for answers. And it is in this context that we meet this man, A.K. Sellström. Sellström is a Swedish medical professor who happens to be one of the world's foremost expert on chemical weapons. He's a veteran of weapons inspection teams in Iraq. He's also a pacifist, someone who hates war, and someone who knows that if he finds evidence of a war crime, there might be consequences. The conflict could expand and intensify. One night, while he and his team are in Damascus, there's a horrific new attack on the outskirts of the capital. The UN inspectors actually witnessed that attack as it is underway. The artillery rockets launched from the northern hills above Syria, above Damascus, arc over central Damascus, landing on targets in the south and east. And when dawn breaks, it's clear that this was no ordinary attack. More than 1,000 people have been killed by poison gas, many of them small children still in their pajamas. Sellström's immediate impulse is to go to the crime scene and collect evidence. This is the reason he came to Syria in the first place. But his very presence in Syria becomes a controversy. The Syrians don't want him roaming around looking for evidence. President Obama wants him out because he's preparing a missile strike, and Sellström is in the way. You can't have the optic of someone doing fact checking or fact gathering on the ground while you're launching missiles at a target. But the Swede continues to insist, and eventually he wins permission to leave Damascus and go to the rebel towns where the attacks took place. The caveat is he has to go unarmed, on his own, with no security escorts. This turns out to be an extremely difficult situation for him. There's a fateful moment early in the expedition as the UN team's convoy is preparing to cross into no man's land. All of a sudden, the lead vehicle comes under attack. Bullets smack against the car's frame. The tires are blown out. The passenger windows are shot up. The windshield. The glass is shatter resistant and designed to hold up against small arms fire, but only to a degree. Now it is starting to crack and weaken. The UN convoy quickly turns around and heads back to a military outpost. The narrative picks up at a point where Sellström and two of his advisors are trying to decide what to do next. Mohammed Kafaji was the most familiar with the local terrain, so Sellström turned to him with his most pressing question. "What do we do, Mohammed?" he asked. Kafaji didn't hesitate. "We go in again," he said. "What?" Sellström was incredulous. "If we don't go today, we'll never go," Kafaji said. "They'll know they can frighten us and your mission will be over." Sellström sat quietly thinking. He was asked to send his team back down a road where a waiting sniper was merely the only threat of which they were absolutely certain. "Okay," he said, "we go in again." Moments later, the Toyotas lined up again for a fresh attempt to cross into rebel territory. This one would look markedly different. Rather than cautiously feeling their way through no man's land, they would dash across it like inmates on a prison break. Kafaji grabbed a spare armored jacket and, scooting down into a seat, used his feet to press it up against the windshield. Team members in the other cars did the same. When everyone was ready, the SUVs passed the checkpoint and tore down the narrow road with as much speed as the drivers could muster. The vehicles shot across the bridge and did not slow until all four were well on the other side. This time, no shots were fired. Evidence is found and collected, and as history records, the missiles did not fly. Instead, a deal was struck, a deal to do something that had never been attempted, and which sounded pretty impossible. There would be no missiles if Syria would submit to the removal and destruction of its entire chemical arsenal, its main strategic weapons system, in 9 months, in the middle of a war. In the book, we get a glimpse of how the deal came together and why. We watch as an international team is hastily assembled to oversee this mammoth task, guided by this remarkable Dutch diplomat, Sigrid Kaag. Sigrid is a UN official who has no military experience and had no familiarity with chemical weapons, but she has the mental toughness to go head-to-head with the leaders of Syria's notoriously brutal and very much male-dominated regime. She quickly discovers that no one really thinks that Syria is going to give up its weapons at all, and many countries would prefer that they don't. They would prefer to see the deal collapse. And yet she persists and keeps the disarmament mission on task, despite challenges and threats, including occasional mortar fire and artillery fire, including one shell that lands in the top of her hotel and goes down several floors and it stops in a bedroom a few floors above her. Despite those scares, she succeeds. Syria's declared stockpile, which ended up being about 90 to 95% of Assad's total production, plus his equipment, his manufacturing equipment, is destroyed or hauled to a harbor to be taken out to sea. And yet when it's over, Kaag can't quite make herself happy about it or bring herself to be happy about it. She says at one point, "I hope the people of Syria can forgive us. We didn't change their lives." But getting the weapons out of Syria is only half the struggle. What do you do next? Who will take the weapons and neutralize them? And the answer is no one. The Pentagon had its Margarita machine, but it had no place to put them. No country was willing to open up one of its seaports to a toxic cargo like this one. With literally no other options, the Pentagon decides that Tim Blades' Margarita machines could be used, but they had to be bolted onto the deck of an old cargo ship. And Blades would be placed in charge of what would become the world's first floating chemical weapons destruction factory operating in the middle of the Mediterranean. This is not an optimal solution. A ship at sea is constantly moving and flexing. The entire vessel pitches and rolls with the sea swell. Pipes and hoses get stretched and pulled. A big storm or a rogue wave can overturn equipment or even the ship itself. Experts at the Pentagon call this idea harebrained, but in early 2014, the ship was the only option that remained. So Tim Blades and his Maryland crew, most of them professed landlubbers, totally inexperienced at sea, climb aboard the motor vessel Cape Ray to attempt a feat that had never been tried in history. There are challenges, including big ones. There's a major equipment malfunction. Then comes a leak. Parts wear out because the corrosive nature of the chemicals. As the work progresses, the ship becomes increasingly unstable because fuel is being burned off at the bottom of the ship and more waste products are moving to the top, to the point that there's a stability crisis and a real worry about the possibility of capsizing. Meanwhile, news stories about the chemical weapons ship spinning circles around in the Mediterranean sparks outrage across Southern Europe, and some of the opponents begin to organize. A flotilla of private vessels, protest ships, departs from Crete to hunt for the Cape May. Somehow, it all works. 42 days later, the last of the barrels of deadly chemicals is destroyed. There's a congratulatory email from one of the team leaders that sums it up like this: 5 months to create the first ever field deployable hydrolysis system, 66 days to outfit the vessel, 42 days to destroy 600 metric tons of Syria's most dangerous chemical weapons at sea. The number that we will never know is the number of men, women, and children in Syria who were saved from death by chemical weapons. So at least for a moment, here was a cause of celebration and real success. But it's a mixed success, one that was quickly overshadowed by other problems, including the continuing and unrelenting human tragedy in Syria itself. For the international community, there are failures that are apparent for all to see, and they overshadow even successes like this one. Syria's dictator lost his strategic stockpile, the crowning achievement of Syria's military establishment, but Assad didn't lose all his weapons. Some were hidden away, as we see in the book. More importantly, Assad never abandoned his intention to use them. Despite the humiliation of the disarmament deal, and even after the later military strikes by the Trump administration, he continued to use chemical weapons, along with every other weapon in his arsenal, from barrel bombs to artillery shells. Assad was never punished for his war crimes. He never lost his grip on power. And thanks to his ally, Russia, he never faced a moment of accountability. Because of this, the international taboo against chemical weapons has suffered serious weakening. Other actors took notice of Assad's flouting of international law and drew their own lessons. ISIS launched an ambitious program to make its own chemical weapons with significant success before it was shut down with military operations. Within 3 years of this chemical weapons milestone, Russia and North Korea would both use chemical weapons in assassination attempts outside their borders. So the inexorable erosion of this 100-year-old taboo continues. Just as the suffering continues in Syria, this tragic country, this place that most Americans would prefer to forget, this place that has been the source of so much anguish for so many, and yet very possibly could have been, if we could imagine such a thing, even worse. Thank you for your time and attention. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Joby. I think all of us listening in get the sense of how this kind of is very much like a Le Carre thriller, but it actually happened. And now we're going to hear from Jim Jeffrey, who was working in senior positions in government throughout this period, and will bring that authoritative perspective to the conversation. So Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. And again, Jane, Bob, thank you for your kind words. Joby, and thank you for that great book. I thought I knew everything about Syria. I learned how little I actually did know. Two general points. First of all, The book, while it focuses on the chemical weapons issue, makes clear that Syria is a far more complicated set of horrific developments, of challenges to the international community, and that you have to look at what I say is not just the little parts of or the very threatening parts of the elephant that the blind people, the international community, are touching. The French with their Paris horrific terrorist attack from ISIS out of Syria, the Germans with an almost overthrowing of their government because of 1 million refugees out of Syria, and on and on. But there is an underlying geopolitical aspect to this. Again, the book, while focusing in the most interesting way possible on the chemical weapons account, made that clear. Let me follow up on that. The international community, I would say, the system actually worked this time, just compared to the other major international effort on weapons of mass destruction in the 1990s through 2003 on Iraq. Both the international community's activities turned out to be, in many cases, false, incorrect. They either overshot the target and thought they were weapons or programs when they weren't, or didn't think they were when they in fact were. And of course, the military response was massive overkill with problems we all know. This time, however, the system seemed to work well, despite the usual hardline position of the Assad regime, despite its support in international fora by Russia, backed up by China. The OPCW and the UN were extremely flexible, supported by the international community, supported by NGOs, human rights organizations, and of course the Syrian people who are bravely bringing out physical evidence to actually document this. When you look at the mind-boggling list of different UN and OPCW organizations, the JIM, Joint Investigative Mechanism, the IIT, the Investigation and Inspection Team, the fact-finding mission. And so these all reflect efforts to get to the truth that succeeded in getting to the truth, that chemical weapons were used, and put the blame squarely on the Assad regime again and again, despite being blocked seemingly at every turn by the threatening coalition of Russia, Syria, and China. And then the military actions actually succeeded after the second one, with one minor exception, in stopping the use of chemical weapons. But at the end of the day, as you summed up at the end of your presentation, Joby, we not only have Assad in power, we think there are still some chemical weapons present in Syria. The program is still continuing, according to US officials that have talked to me. And there is every indication that if he could get away with it, Assad would use chemical weapons again. So my question, Joby, is this time, all of the things that we have set up institutionally to deal with these things, including a military response when the other side, when diplomacy doesn't work, seem to actually function, but we're still left with the problem. What conclusion do you draw from that?
You know, and it's a terrific analysis. And I look at this in a way as the last great act of multilateralism, the one that came together in the fall of 2013, when countries did some pretty amazing things with support of Russia, including, you know, drafting UN resolutions, OPCW resolutions, forming this international inspection team that had never existed before, money being contributed, you know, all these things clicked. And it happened in a flash by UN standards. Certainly, it was you know, these folks are on the ground within weeks, and that really never happens. And yet at the same time, this whole saga reveals the weaknesses within this system. So as successful as this initial effort was, ultimately it highlighted all the challenges and problems with these multilateral solutions, because ultimately Russia was able to block and veto accountability. Russia saw in its interest getting, you know, the declared stockpile out of Syria, but after that, it essentially had Assad's back. It refused to let serious accountability procedures go through the UN or through the criminal court or other places. It defended or blocked any criticism of his use of chlorine, because as we know, very well from our recent history. After the sarin was removed, Assad just turned to this industrial chemical chlorine, which is easily available. It can't be outlawed. You use it to clean drinking water. You put it in your swimming pools. He had tons of that around, so use that instead. So the intention was never eroded because there was no accountability, and that's because of many reasons, but partly because the way the international system is designed, it's so easy to block accountability. And that's what Russia and other allies were able to do.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Let me go from the very general to the very specific, very insider stuff that I think you're the guy to answer. We start with the title of the book, The Red Line, the famous Obama Red Line, and we start with the picture you flashed of Kerry and Lavrov sitting down. Probably that was the meeting where Kerry suddenly proposed, or he had actually proposed into the media, the idea of a diplomatic resolution. Let's unravel that a little bit. The president stated that he would use military force, and he was actually planning on doing it. Then the British Parliament took a vote because they were going to participate with us, and the vote turned out negative. That had an impact on the president. He did his Rose Garden walk with Dennis McDonough and decided maybe we wouldn't. So it looked like we were shifting away from military pressure. But at the same time, you had John Kerry, who was a very aggressive proponent of military force. And even though people said this is never going to fly, I heard that congressional correspondence was 10-1 against taking military action, another Vietnam or another Iraq, probably. Yet the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, John Kerry's friends, passed it out, the resolution of support. So it looked like possibly we would go ahead. Did we fake out the Russians into accepting this agreement because they thought we were actually going to use force when it was beginning to be clear in Washington this ain't ever going to happen? What's your view?
Yeah, I think that's extremely perceptive, because the folks I've spoken to who are working this issue at the time do describe this perception that Russia took the red line more seriously than we did. I don't think they believe that we were going to decapitate the regime, and that was never in our military plan. I think the people in Syria might have expected that, kind of a broader military strike, but it was really punitive. But Russia wanted to protect its guy, so it was afraid of the possible consequences of a U.S. strike. So it was very committed to making sure that didn't happen. So their interest was in preventing it somehow. And the rabbit that was pulled out of the hat was this deal that no one ever thought was possible, but the Russians pretty much jammed down Assad's throat. Having achieved that, there were some other benefits for this brief moment. Putin looks like a statesman. He's kind of putting together this deal that no one else could have managed without him. And then he's somewhat able to dictate the terms of how this would happen. One of the sort of the hamstring effect on the OPCW was the fact that they were never able to reach conclusions about who was behind these chemical weapons attacks. They could round up the weapons and get rid of them. They can conduct their investigations and say that, yeah, sarin was used here and there, but the rules said that they couldn't ever identify the culprit. And so you have these absurdities where for years afterward, as recently as, well, even now, Syrian officials are able to go to the UN, OPCW, and say, that wasn't us. We never used chemical weapons. Up until 2013, they did not even having chemical weapons. And so it's really a theater of the absurd that develops over time as Assad just gets a free pass again and again because of his buddies in Russia.
Yeah, I would challenge that very briefly, because some of the later investigative mechanisms, including the IIT, were charged with and delivered condemnations of the Assad regime, stating not only was it done by regime forces, they named high-level forces, they picked some units sometimes. And the OPCW, in a session in July of last year, put the Syrian government on record. It had to come clean by October. It didn't come clean. It didn't even respond by October. The OPCW took further action, basically isolating Syria within the organization, then went to the Security Council. Again, the system was actually working properly in a way it didn't with the whole Iraq saga for over a decade, yet we're still at this juncture that you pointed out. So my last question is, What recommendation on Syria do you have for the new Biden administration that, as we both know, is still sloshing about trying to figure out what to do with that thorny problem?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. And you're absolutely right about how the OPCW has evolved to try to deal with this accountability issue. And they finally, as of 2017 and 18, mechanisms in place to point a finger. And Assad has continued to ignore it, but at least there is documents that exist that say, yeah, this was Assad's sarin. He's responsible. His regime was perpetrated this act. But for the Biden administration, I get the sense in my early conversations, they've got so much on their plate right now. They'd love very much to be able to not have to deal with the crisis in Syria, and yet the news is already invading this space. And we just saw last night this military strike on a border crossing in eastern Syria. That was a response to to the previous artillery strikes on a military base in Erbil. And so I think there will be an effort to try to project firmness, especially early on when different players are going to be testing the Biden administration to see what they will do. At the same time, this administration is full from top to bottom of folks who have the experience, in some cases, the scars from the last round, and so they will be a bit wiser. I think they will try to be measured, but I think they do understand most of all the need to be engaged diplomatically and also with people on the ground in eastern Syria in particular, because leaving that battlefield or that diplomatic space to other players could end up with disastrous consequences, not just for us, but for our allies in the region. So we really need to be players. I think they know that.
Amen. Thank you, Rob.
Over to you for a first question and your own comment.
Well, thank you, everybody. That was absolutely fascinating. And I agree that teaching history through stories is extremely effective. And the beginning of your book is just riveting, Joby, about that. The senior scientist with the two wives, who also was a CIA asset. I just want to ask about the before and the after very quickly. I recall in the early 2000s going to Damascus with a small group of my colleagues on the House Intelligence Committee and meeting with Bashar Assad in his palace. Mm-hmm. And Damascus was in a thriving city with a huge souk, quite successful, seemed to me, metropolis. He was new. And the lore was, this guy was different. He wasn't his father, and he wasn't even his brother, who had died mysteriously. He was this ophthalmologist from London who had been forced to come home. He was stuck temporarily with his father's advisors because he was, but that over time he'd get rid of them and he would become a moderate in the region. Did we miss the movie? I mean, that was the conversation at the time. It was a cordial enough meeting. And again, this was pre-Civil War. Second part of the question, just the bookend on the back of this. I mean, you just said, Joby, that by some of the moves we took over this period, we let other actors in. Surely Russia was one, but the other one is Iran. And this targeted bombing that just happened in Syria was to retaliate against, as I understand it, Iranian proxies in Syria targeting Iraq. So I guess my question is, did we totally miss Bashar? Maybe this is for you too, who he was. But secondly, did we, not somebody else, but we, the United States, basically enable Syria to become this proxy ground, both for Russia and for Iran in ways that maybe we should have predicted? And what do we do now about that?
Yeah, two really great questions, Jane, and I thought a lot about both of these. On the first one, whether we missed an opportunity with Bashar, yeah, it's quite interesting that this was not the role he was seeking. He was very happy being ophthalmologist and having a quiet practice. The story on him is that he became an ophthalmologist because he was afraid of the sight of blood. Imagine that. But here's a guy who comes into power, has his own ideas, and briefly flirts with more freedoms for his people. There's this thing that happens doesn't get a lot of attention in the West, but it's called Damascus Spring, where there's little coffee salons and then some news publications pop up. And this is the time when folks such as yourself are heading over there and saying, well, maybe he's a reasonable guy. You've got also next door in Jordan, King Abdullah is brand new to the throne. So there's a moment where maybe there's some reform that's possible. I think Bashar ended up being talked out of that himself. The security apparatus of that state is so all pervasive. They have his ear. They were able to convince him that this Arab Spring business or this Damascus Spring was dangerous, and so they rooted that out and they crushed it, very brutally. And so Assad kind of becomes convinced that, well, maybe my dad was right. The way to rule a country like this is with an iron fist. And so he experiments with some economic reforms, but the idea of dissent and freedom of expression just really goes away. And you can see the evolution of this man as he gets deeper and deeper into his leadership. He becomes a complete prisoner of the extremists in his regime, the hardliners. And I remember one colleague who was describing his conversations with some of the people around Assad as the uprising was starting, and saying, this brutality, we're built for this. This is what we do. And this is why the opposition is never going to succeed, because we are willing to destroy the country literally to make sure that we stay in power. And that was their formula for success. But in the process, this leads to the second part of the question. They kind of run out of people, they run out of soldiers, they run out of money pretty quickly. So Assad could not have survived without major infusions of resources from the Iranians first, who committed, first they kind of allowed their proxy Hezbollah to get involved militarily. They sent a lot of money and oil and other resources. And then finally comes Soleimani and his just generalship to help them out of some tight spots. And so over time, Assad becomes completely dependent on the Iranians and the Russians. And in the case of the Iranians, they can now dictate terms to some extent, to the degree that the Russians will let them. They can, set up their little proxy militia groups. They can set up, bases for manufacturing weapons, which they've done, and the Israelis have caught them doing. And they can also even, we've seen them depopulate areas, moving Sunni folks out of traditional Sunni villages and allowing Iranians to settle in. That's happened in a number of locations. So in a way, it's become, really an Iranian province more than it ever was. You have a very weak leader who really needs the help of Iran. And so that's another reason why we have to stay engaged. And I think that Ambassador Jeffrey would agree with this. If we allow this to really become an Iranian state, then we're in for some big trouble.
Joby, could we just turn to an issue that you deal with extensively in the book, which we didn't have a chance in your opening remarks to really kind of flesh out, and that's the Islamic State piece of it. Okay, can you talk about? I mean, Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, they're interested in weapons of mass destruction. They figured out that biological weapons are technically challenging, nuclear weapons are, but chemical have been sort of a poor man's weapon of mass destruction. In terms of ability to fabricate and then use it. Can you just talk first about how the Islamic State sort of thought about the use of chemical weapons in their arsenal? And also, can you just connect the dot between the Assad regime's acquisition and use of these, and then the related fear that in the chaos of Syria, they might fall into the hands of the Islamic State?
That's a really important question. And in my real entree into this whole area, I was covering the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, 2012. And because a lot of my sources were in the intelligence world in the region and also over here, the thing that they would talk about day after day was this chemical weapons problem. There were a lot of countries involved in the Arab Spring. Only one had a weapon of mass destruction, and it was Syria. And it was not just because we had a spy, we knew what they had. It was not just mustard gas. It was not just low-grade stuff. It was some of the worst, most deadly substances ever made, and they had a lot of it, and it was scattered around the country. When the country starts to crack up, as it's doing in late 2011, 2012, this is the thing that's keeping people up at night. The possibility that one of these bases is going to get overrun. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see somebody with a pickup truck grabbing one of those tankers and just heading to Turkey with it, or and the way these weapons are configured, it's like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You've got product A, All you need is product B, which you can buy at any drugstore, and you've got lethal sarin. And ISIS was very much aware of this. Back in the Al-Qaeda days, we can remember Osama bin Laden saying, getting weapons of mass destruction is a religious duty for us. They tried really hard in Afghanistan to come up with something when they had, when Taliban ruled the country. And Zarqawi, the godfather of ISIS, when he was running around in Iraq, he had the same idea, and he was beginning to talk about chlorine bombs and using chlorine as a chemical weapon. So everybody knows that they wanted these weapons. If there had been an opportunity for them to knock something over and grab something, they would have done it. They came close in a number of instances, within a few hundred yards of overrunning bases where stuff was stored, but they didn't get it ultimately. ISIS missed its chance. And so what we see is by 2014, when ISIS now has territory, it has half of Syria and a big chunk of Iraq, it starts to put together a program, starts to build factories for developing chemical weapons of its own. And if it had gotten more time, if we hadn't been so intent on targeting these facilities and denying ISIS of its caliphate, they would have succeeded. They managed to make mustard gas. It wasn't very good, but they made it and they used it in battle, and they had bigger ideas. There's no question that this is now part of their potential playbook. They know how to do it if they want to, if they have the resources in the future. So it's a problem that's with us now, even after the caliphate's gone away.
That's a really great point, Joby. That the relationship between state and non-state kind of actors. That what you had in Syria is sort of the fracturing of a state and capabilities potentially on the loose. Outside actors facing the dilemma of how do you constitute a state and address the actions of an actor, Assad, who's sort of operating within the sovereign borders of Syria. And that's been a perennial issue in international relations of how you deal with states that are committing horrific acts. But certainly the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda aspire to acquire these mass casualty capabilities, and there would be there's no political or moral constraint on them. I mean, the constraints are practical and technical, which really goes to the point, and Jim worked on this in government, was in the campaign to deny the Islamic State the attributes of a state, which they would need to develop some of these capabilities, such as occupying Mosul University's chemistry department and having access to all that capability. And one last point on verification, and I'll tag a question onto it for the two of you, is that here you had actual Syrian CW use, kind of as smoking a gun as you get in this business, and yet Putin was saying, yes, there was a chemical attack, but it was done by the opposition, not by the regime. And we had the IIT report, Jim, that you cited, I believe, ascribing attribution to the Syrian regime. But this issue of attribution, it's a big one in the nuclear terrorism field. If something went off, how would you trace it back to the source and hold that source accountable, given that a lot of the nuclear capabilities are really in the province of state actors? So it's a different kind of category. But the question I have leading up to from that comment is, how do we restore the taboo, in a way? And you had Russia, incredibly using a chemical agent in Salisbury. And there have been other uses by state actors of chemical agents, North Korea in Kuala Lumpur airport, et cetera. Joby, Jim, what thoughts on how the taboo in horrific humanitarian contexts like that prompted the red line threat, how can that be reinforced, and then beyond that in individual terrorism acts, how can we create a punitive structure where a state will feel that they really can't resort to that as an instrument of state policy?
I guess I can take it first if you don't mind, Ambassador, but countering disinformation requires facts and evidence. And fortunately, the gathering of facts is getting better and better and better. I've had a lot of discussions with people at the OPCW that do this for a living, and the ability to link a single chemical weapons attack to a manufacturing capability, or look at the sort of the precursor ingredients and figure out where they came from. They're getting better and better and better at doing that, and they're putting that evidence out there in a public place. One example that comes through as sort of a thread in the book is the use of a single chemical additive in the sarin that Assad makes. It's called hexamine. It's unusual because nobody else uses it in making sarin, but the Syrians figured out that it had this use as what's called an acid scavenger, so it prevents sarin from breaking down and becoming less effective over time. So they used that back in the 80s, and then later on, every attack that we've collected evidence, or the international community has collected evidence from that attack, they've been able to find these traces of hexamine. So it's almost a signature. It's a calling card for this regime's product. And so you find that evidence, you put it in a place where people can see it and test it and ask questions about it. And then hopefully you win the argument. The problem has become, I think, what we've seen over the course of this conflict is the sort of escalation in the fact war that the Russians can just repeat the lie again and again, that it wasn't Assad, or it wasn't us going after Skripal. It was a false flag attack. It wasn't us who tried to kill Navalny, last summer. And they just repeat these same, lies, and they're repeated in the echo chamber by bots and sort of Twitter followers. That it's incredible how many there are, because I see a lot of them online myself. But eventually one has to hope, among civilized nations of the world, that facts and evidence still count. And I think that's the job of the OPCW these days, and I hope they'll continue the effort.
Well,
Jim, do you have a comment on that?
yeah, I'll be a little bit optimistic on this one from my own experience. This isn't a linear cause and effect, but the point is the international community, despite tremendous pushback from Russia and concerns about Iran, has taken, beginning with the Obama administration, then through the Trump administration, through the UN Security Council with Resolution 2254 at the end of 2015, the OPCW's actions, the Arab League throwing Assad out, EU sanctions, Congress passing the very tough CISA sanctions. In other words, the international community, in their own indirect and multifaceted way, has decided Syria under Assad is not a normal country. We don't know how we're going to fix this, but God damn it, we're not going to allow it to be treated like a normal country until we can figure out how to fix it. That's a partial solution, and I came to kind of find charm in partial solutions as an alternative to just giving up, letting this guy get away with all of the war crimes he's done, of which Joby has documented brilliantly, the chemical weapons file, and throwing up our hands and saying, we can't do this. It's not perfect. It could, in the end, be run off the tracks, but we're still in the game as an international community, demanding somehow, some way, Assad and his henchmen and have to pay and have to change, or they're not going to be accepted back into the international community. So not a great solution, but there you go.
Well, just following on from that, Joby, in the book, I think, I can't remember which diplomat said it, that Putin has a red line, and his red line is the survival of Assad. And Jim, you've had a lot of experience kind of dealing with the Russian dimension of Russian policies in the Middle East. And Joby, that's a part of the book that you kind of deal with extensively. Can we look ahead now and sort of try to extrapolate? You were asked, like, what are the implications of your book for the Biden administration, which is, we know everything that's on their plate in this country and globally, and when they'll get to kind of a Syria policy, it's not a kind of a month one problem issue for them. But where's Russia? How do the two of you view Russia at this point? Any evolution in their position? Does that red line, Assad survival, still hold? Any softening of their support, or shift in their regional aspirations? Maybe start with Jim on this one.
Okay, having heard Putin say almost those exact words, this is a problem. The position we took in the Trump administration, as I said, it was building on the somewhat less focused, but still in the right place, Obama administration, was fine. Our red line is Assad and his criminal gang are not going to become a normal country, are not going to enjoy the rehabilitation and reconstruction. I think it's $40 $400 billion, the World Bank estimates, to put the country back together again. None of that happens on our watch until it changes. So now you've got two red lines, the international communities, because that wasn't just two administrations, it's also the Europeans in their own way, the Arab League, and the UN, versus Russia and friends. And in that realm of those two red lines, there's the possibility, we couldn't get to it in the Trump administration. Part of it was we had only so many months left by the time we really had convinced the Russians they were in a military stalemate, and the Assad regime may have, quote, won in the sense of not losing, but they had not, were not left with any kind of viable country. That is an opening for the next administration. They have 4 years, minus a few weeks at this point, to convince the Russians that whatever they commit to will be US and likely Western policy for the next 4 years. That's the opening I see. And in fact, we've the Kennan Center has just published a piece I wrote on that, or is publishing it now in the Kennan Cable. Excellent. Joby.
I think the Ambassador is absolutely right. And there is a moment here because Syria has become an expensive problem. I mean, the Syrian regime is in economic crisis. You know, it's because of its own problems and continued warfare, but also because of spillover from next door in Lebanon. But the place is in trouble, and so there's real risks to Assad and his regime that are unrelated to the civil war that's been going on for 10 years. There's the sort of the Turkish area that just seems to be kind of a permanent feature now of the north. You can see this being becoming, you know, an opportunity for Putin to be a deal maker again, to be able to say that, yeah, there's this isn't sustainable. Let's just come up with something. And Lord knows what it would be, but I do agree there's an opportunity now.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Jane Harman to conclude today's session, which has been noted as probably her final one as president. She becomes emerita. We get the gender rights in the Wilson Center in our Latin shortly. But before handing off to her for whatever comments you might have on what she's heard today, which I think is a marvelous example of the kind of high quality policy, relevant research that the Wilson Center conducts. And we bring together top experts from a variety of professions. In Joby's case, it happens to be journalism. Jim has come to us from government, but we have a large cadre of academic-based scholars as well, which really are all part of the mix at the Wilson Center. And I think those listening in today really had a great kind of sense of how the Wilson Center seeks to fulfill its mission through supporting the kind of research that Joby has done in his fantastic new book, Redline. And with that, let me turn the floor over to the woman who is still our president, Jane Harman, for any last words to conclude today's session.
Well, let me say that while this was going on, I don't know if I can pick it up, but maybe I can. This phenomenal bouquet of flowers just arrived from the Wilson Center. Now I can't see anybody, but I'll move it back. Hold on. So thank you. I'll take it. It makes me feel great. But I have called the center, and I still will, an intellectual candy store. And my point is, you can learn an enormous amount. Your brain gets bigger, but you don't get fat. And so I'm going to stay on the Wilson Center diet and learn more. And I learned a lot here. I just make an observation, or two observations. One is, Joby is in a tradition of 5,000 scholars, not fellows, who bring their brilliance, publish their books, get too many Pulitzer Prizes. I mean, how many do you need, Joby, in one little lifetime, for God's sake? You might share with other people, just saying. But my point is, that's a tradition of the Wilson Center, and we all learn so much. But now let's focus on Jim for a minute. Jim is a esteemed senior diplomat who comes fresh from the administration to the Wilson Center, but with experience prior to the administration. He and I, for example, served together on the State Department Foreign Policy Board that John Kerry had set up. This was, I think Jim was between gigs. I'm not exactly sure what that was, but and I did that while I was at the Wilson Center. But the point is, Jim's observations are so interesting too, alongside Joby's, to really put us in the picture of what could happen in Syria. And this is my final comment. Maybe Rob, you want to say something after me, because this is kind of your bag. You know, as you have worked on North Korea, and we have looked together at Iran and so forth, we all conclude that regime survival is the ultimate reason why the leaders of these countries do what they do. What's interesting about what Joby was just saying, and you know, and Jim, and the reemergence of Russia as a possible deal maker, is Bashar may have overplayed it. He now owes his regime survival to horrible weapons, but also the Russians and maybe the Iranians. So I guess my question is, could we see an example here of a guy who blew it in spite of being this, you know, war criminal, because he put too much stock in other countries, and maybe even ISIS, who parked on his territory in order to keep him in office?
Well, that's a wonderful comment and question, Jane, and is one, as the time for today's session has lapsed, is going to be on our Middle East program's agenda. I am confident with Jim Jeffrey and Marissa Kerma, Alex Farley, and the team to address in the future.
And don't forget Robin Wright, the amazing Robin Wright.
Absolutely.
Our Ron primer.
So
we have half of Robin, which is a lot of Robin, because she's so brilliant.
So today's, I'm going to conclude today's proceedings just with a word of thanks to Jim Jeffrey for participating today with a comment and being our discussant, and then to the main act, Joby Warrick, who has done it again. I mean, you know, a Le Carre-like thriller in a wonderful literary style. Joby, is there a fourth book in you? And think of Wilson. But we get through this one first, okay?
Absolutely.
So, anyway,
we'll see.
We're concluded for today. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions, which I tried to integrate into our conversation. Until next time at the Wilson Center, goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.